Okay, this is Chris from IELTS Advantage, and today we're going to look at another IELTS speaking video. We're going to look at one of the most common mistakes that students make in their IELTS speaking test. So what we're going to do today, we're going to look at the common mistake and we're going to look at examples of that common mistake. We're going to look at why you should not do this, when it is acceptable in very limited circumstances, and what you can do instead. So some advice to help you improve. So what is the big mistake that lots of students make in their speaking test? It's overusing fillers and memorized sentences. So if you don't know what that means, let's look at some examples. So here are some examples of memorized fillers, and these are just examples. There are lots more of these. This is just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, so it's not just limited to these examples. So starting off your answer with "That's an interesting question," or "I'm glad you asked me that question." I've never thought about that before, but if I had to give an answer, I would say, so starting your answer in that way. It is my personal opinion that I am of the opinion that it depends on. So, as I said, these are just some examples of memorized sentences that students mostly use at the beginning of their answers. So, why are these such a problem? The examiner know that you have memorized these answers. They know for a fact that these are not natural, normal answers. It does not matter how good your grammar and vocabulary is, memorized answers do not count. So the main reason why students memorize these answers is because they think that the grammar is good, the vocabulary is good. They might have practiced very hard to make sure that the pronunciation is good and the fluency is good for these answers. So they think that these answers will really boost their score and help them get a good score. It won't. The examiners know for a fact that these are memorized. They've heard them 1,000 times before, and they do not count towards your score for pronunciation, for vocabulary, for grammar, for fluency. It's like you didn't say them at all. And also, you're answering the question in a very unnatural way. It might sound silly, but lots of students I've said to, why are you doing the IELTS test, or what's your name, or where do you come from? And they say, that's a very interesting question. If you met someone for the first time and you were talking to them and they asked your name, would you ever say that's an interesting question? Or I'm glad you answered. How old are you? I'm glad you asked that question. You would never do that in a natural conversation. So why would you do it in the IELTS test? And this is especially true for parts 1 and 2. So parts 1 and 2, you shouldn't be using these phrases at all. Part 1 is just general, everyday, familiar topics like about yourself. So things like your work and your study, where you're from, your likes and dislikes, so general everyday things. You would never say, no one has ever asked me that question before, but if I had to say, or in my opinion, I am from blah blah blah, wherever you're from. You would just never use these phrases for normal everyday conversation. Part 2, you have a minute to prepare before you start talking, so there is no need for you to use these questions. You're just using up time that would be better spent actually answering the question directly. So when is it acceptable to use these phrases? So these fillers and memorized sentences can be used in very limited circumstances. So I tell my students sometimes, and it's only sometimes, when you need a couple of seconds to think. So maybe the question in part 3 is very, very difficult and you don't know straight away how to answer it. And you just need a couple of seconds. So you could use a filler such as, I've never thought about that before, but if I had to say, or something like that. But it should only be in part 3, and it should only be for questions that you can't think of an answer for. So you might only use it once in the entire 15 minutes of the test. It shouldn't be a habit. You really are giving your opinion. So lots of students say, in my opinion, or using in my personal opinion or something like that, a memorized sentence like that, and then they don't give their opinion. So you're showing the examiner, one, that you've memorized the answer, and two, that you don't know how to use the memorized answer. Think about the function that you're using it for. So if someone said, in my opinion, and then they start talking about someone else's opinion, then that's not your opinion. Or if you said something like, some people say that, which is talking about what other people think, and then you give your opinion, that's not using the correct function. So you're going to lose marks because you're not using it correctly. So if you're not going to answer the question directly and you're going to start your sentence with something like, in my opinion, make sure you're using it correctly. You really don't know much about the question. So this is probably the only time that I ever advise my students to use a filler or a memorized question or something like that. So it's in part 3, only in part 3, when they ask you something that you have never thought about and you really have no idea, then it would be okay to say something like, I know nothing about this topic, but if I had to say something, I would say this. Or, I've never thought about this question before and I don't really know much about it. Then you could say this. But again, only when this happens to you. You should not begin every single question with, I've never thought about this before, or I don't really know. So what can you do instead? Practice your speaking. Don't memorize answers. So don't sit with a list of memorized answers and try and perfect these. You won't get any marks for them. You'll sound really unnatural and you'll probably mess them up anyway. You won't use them correctly. Instead, it is a speaking test. It is a skill. You have to practice a skill. Practice your speaking. Don't memorize answers. Answer the questions directly. There's no need to put, in my opinion, or all of these things before the answer, before you actually answer the question. Just answer the question directly. That's what the examiner wants to hear. They want to hear you answering the question. They want to hear you talking. Read. Lots of students use these memorized answers when it would be better if they were reading. What does reading do? It helps you understand a topic. It helps you understand vocabulary. It is the best way to improve your vocabulary. It improves your grammar. It really improves everything, so that when you go into the speaking test, you're confident that you have enough language. And also, listen. Listening will help you with your grammar and vocabulary, just like reading, but it will also help you with your pronunciation, with your fluency, because you'll be listening to how native English speakers talk in real life, and you'll be able to copy them and practice using that listening. So I hope you find that interesting. If you are making these common mistakes, you can stop making them now and follow the advice that I gave towards the end of the video to help you improve your speaking scores. If you have any questions or you need further information, just go to IELTSadvantage.com, or we're also on Facebook.com/IELTSadvantage. Thanks very much. Goodbye.